Okay, well, I'm good to go.
Excellent. Okay, well, welcome to this AmCham China video podcast. My name is Graham Norris, and I'm the Communications Director here at the American Chamber. I'm joined today by Andy Clayton, CEO of LNP China, which helps smaller companies enter and expand in the China market. Andy's going to talk to us about how to get a presence on the ground in China. Welcome, Andy.
Thank you very much, Graham. It's a pleasure to be here today. So what I'm going to talk about today is how companies, particularly smaller and medium-sized companies, when they're entering China and they reach the point of having to have some kind of presence or some form of operations on the ground, how they go about doing that. Now, what we do as a company is we help businesses that are at this stage. So our service involves representing companies who need to get a fixed presence, and as a result, we are at the cutting edge. We get to see what all the companies from around the world, but particularly from Europe, who are entering China, what some of the reasons are for them having to get a presence on the ground, how they're going about it, and also some of the common challenges and pitfalls that they run into. So from the webcast today, if you're a company that has got some interaction, some engagement with China, and you're thinking of taking the next step, I hope what it will give you is some experiences and ideas for how to go about that, and even whether that's a good idea for you or not. So we're going to use a mixture of some case studies and some examples of both companies that we work with and also companies that have done it by themselves to share with you some of those experiences. Also, our marketing team have helpfully peppered this presentation with some pictures from what's going on in China at the moment. So in addition to talking about the content, also I'll throw in a few stories and some of the latest information and current affairs from China just to keep things a bit more interesting moving along. So first off, we have a picture here. This is downtown Beijing, which is where we're based, where a lot of us have called home for a long time now. And that's a picture looking over the World Trade Center area, part of town. So first up, things that we're going to run through today. So why companies from the West need to set up a presence in China, because China is considerably different from other jurisdictions in terms of the need for actually having an entity or some form of partnership there. And then using examples to talk through some of those reasons in a bit more detail. And then ending with the typical challenges that people face, and what are some of the options and means that you can use to get set up over there. So including doing it yourself, what are the type of entities that are available, and also if you're to lean on third parties. Now, this picture here is downtown Tianjin, and we put that in there. We had an interesting experience recently setting up a company in the Tianjin Free Trade Zone. And free trade zones are quite a hot topic in China at the moment. They are test beds that allow the Chinese authorities to tinker with and try new policies for making business a little bit easier, both for local and for foreign companies. So we've jumped on the bandwagon and set up a company in the Tianjin Free Trade Zone with a view of accessing bonded warehouses. And indeed, we have found actually that the registration process is quite a lot quicker and easier than elsewhere and than what we've experienced in the past. However, we've also been very unlucky timing-wise, because the time that we registered this company coincided with this tragic explosion that happened recently in the Tianjin port. So that has held things up. But watch this space in terms of us being able to get our new free trade zone company fully operational. So first off, some of the reasons why people need to get operations going in China. And generally, they fall into some of these main categories. So they need to either have staff based out there, local staff, foreign staff on a temporary or a permanent basis. The second common reason is around finances. So in order to be able to take money locally in China or to pay people locally in China, you need to have local company, local bank accounts. And a lot of that ties in with how the tax system works in China. There's a very physical offline process for issuing and receiving tax invoices out there. A lot of people still set up for reasons around manufacturing, either doing QC and sourcing themselves, or if they have to subcontract or set up some form of bespoke manufacturing and logistics. I'll go through a few examples of those later on. Finally, controlling import and export is sometimes an important thing for companies to be able to do. And then these days, increasingly, people are going in order to sell to the local market. And I'll give a couple of examples of that later on. The background picture here, I think this is our marketing department. Thought this would be an amusing one to throw in. This is Usain Bolt in the recent athletics meet in Beijing. And he lost his feet. He got knocked over by an overzealous Chinese cameraman who lost control of his Segway. So we hope that if you get your feet on the ground in China, that you don't lose them like he did. So let's go to the first example, the case study. And here we've picked a company that we've been working with for a few years. They're a British creative design agency. And they've managed to establish themselves extremely well in China as one of the leading agencies, particularly for the technology sector. So the reason for them having to get operations set up on the ground were principally around being able to bill clients locally and then to actually set up an office and hire a team. So it's interesting to note here, obviously, that they're a service company, not a goods company. And increasingly, particularly companies from the UK that are going to China are selling services in China. This is a part of the market that's growing very fast. It used to be the case in China that services was something we were expected to kind of come free with hardware and kit. But these days, it's really notable how more willing local companies are to pay for quality services. So this is a great area of opportunity for Western companies. But in terms of delivering that, you do need some kind of entity or presence on the ground. Like I say, for hiring local staff and paying them month in, month out, and doing the contracting and their social security. Ditto for foreign staff. And for them, there's the added difficulty of requiring visas, which these days has actually gotten quite a lot harder than it used to be. So there's a significant runaround there. And then setting the whole billing arrangements up and contracts with clients, taking payments, getting bank accounts set up. So this is something that you can do yourself. You can set up what's called a wholly foreign-owned entity to manage those. And they are getting easier and easier to establish. However, the actual management of those WFOEs is still quite a significant body of knowledge. So understanding how the tax and accounting standards work, or understanding how to set up contracts, moving money in and out, things like this tend to still be significant challenges. The background picture here is, again, a bit of news recently. So one of several bits of probably less encouraging economic news out of China is the currency is devalued recently, which is a really interesting change because Chinese currency has been a bit of a one-way bet for goodness, I mean, at least the past 10 years. But now this seems to be shifting into reverse a little bit, and there seems to be a general consensus that the renminbi is maxing out. And this represents all sorts of interesting changes in the Chinese economy, not least the fact that it's becoming less dependent upon exports. This was one of the reasons why the currency kept appreciating. So again, it speaks to a growing maturity in the Chinese market and really the opportunity for getting involved in selling into China because it really is such an exciting market.
Hey there, Andy. Sorry to jump in.
Please.
You were looking earlier on at a picture of Tianjin, where we also have an office. China's a very big place. How does a company such as this creative agency decide where in China to locate?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's really excellent. So in their case, the way that they started was a really interesting one. And I think it probably is indicative and typical of a lot of companies. So if you're a service business, often the way that you get started in China is with a project. Like somehow, somewhere, you've gotten in touch with somebody or they've found you and they say, we'd like you to do a project in China. So if you're an architect firm or if you're selling, for example, services for recruitment, those sorts of things, which are all examples of the kind of clients that we've worked with. You often start with a discrete project. Someone will say, look, I need you to help us on this particular project coming up. And that tends to be geographically distinct. So in the case of this client, they had made a really excellent video around one of their products, which had gone viral on the internet. And there was a show in Beijing that needed somebody to do all the digital backgrounds for the show. So they contacted them and said, we'd like you to come over. And so it was that launch project in Beijing that got them started in China. So they then continued to build up their presence from that city. They were able to hire a general manager there, because Beijing obviously has a good pool of talent for that sort of thing. And that was their ground zero.
Got it. So following the customers.
Absolutely, yeah. And I've seen that in lots of examples. Typically people, the place where they have their first project tends to be where they'll get their feet on the ground in terms of a fixed presence, because it starts with the operational support for that first project.
Right.
Okay, a second example, and this is an interesting one for slightly different reasons. There's increasing talk around how China, because of the increase in its cost base and the value of its currency and so on, is becoming less competitive from a sourcing point of view. And there is a degree of truth to that. I mean, we do see some industries that are starting to move to other countries. However, you cannot underestimate how important China remains from a manufacturing and sourcing point of view, to the extent where there are still a lot of companies going into China in order to set up sourcing operations. So the story that we see, although there are people that are gradually migrating to other countries, there is still a healthy degree of business of companies coming in to set up sourcing operations. And this is an example of one. It's a client that we had done some sourcing before, and they decided to increase their presence in China and actually set up a sourcing office. Now, part of that is to do with quality control and negotiation with factories. But in their case, and this is something that we see for quite a few companies in this sort of situation, is they're using China as their workshop for clients all over the world, because they service clients not just in the UK. And they've previously been in the situation of importing all their goods into one location in the UK and then redistributing, and that adds a significant cost to the supply chain. So for companies like that, it makes much more sense to actually do that distribution straight out of China. So to consolidate all of what they're purchasing in China into one warehouse and then ship directly to end users. And China is still extremely well set up for this. Warehouse space is plentiful and relatively easy to acquire. Now, it's not always as well managed or as secure as in the West, but there are still a lot of very workable options warehouse-wise. It's relatively easy to find people with the skill base to manage that kind of an office and deal with the paperwork for exporting stuff. Now, obviously, again, there is a learning curve, particularly you then take on the import-export piece yourself. So you need to develop a strong understanding and some staff internally who can interact with customs effectively. And you need a good logistics provider. But this is a workable solution for even quite small and medium-sized companies. The way that this particular company did is they decided to do it themselves. They sent out one of their senior management team to be based in Hong Kong. They then set up an entity in China, hired their staff member number one, and gradually down in Guangdong built up the capability through sourcing third-party warehouse space, and starting with with a few test orders and building out their processes in that way. So it does take a little bit of time, especially if you're doing it yourself. But this is still very much a viable business and something that we see people continuing to do. The picture in the background here is the Chinese stock markets, which have had the headlines in the past few months for famously taking a precipitous rise in the first half of the year and then promptly crashing in the second half, and not for the first time. This has been part of quite a lot of mixed economic news out of China, but it's the one I think that people have latched upon because it's been so dramatic. There's nothing like a stock market crash in terms of wiping value off things, and so people have taken it as being indicative of a wider Chinese crash, and that is something of a red herring. That's not the case. In China, it's not because the stock market crashes that the rest of the economy follows. It's something of a casino, and we're much more concerned to see things like sourcing manager indexes dropping and overall business activity dropping rather than we are seeing a crash in the stock market. Having said that, it is obviously one of many negative indicators recently. So moving on to the next example here. This is also a sourcing one. This is a company that we started working with recently around setting up operations for the bespoke manufacturing of shirts. And the reason I included this one here is because a lot of the talk recently has been around China's cost base having increased, that they're losing out in some of the lower tech industries. And textiles is always given an example of this. So I thought I'd throw in an example here of a company that's moving into China right now to set up an old school textile stitching business. These guys have a really interesting business model, which involves using technology and using your iPhone to take a photograph of your body, and thereby being able to produce drawings for tailored shirts. But these guys, they're still choosing China as the place to have those shirts manufactured. Now, China doesn't have the cost advantage that it used to, but it has such a phenomenal critical mass of skilled workers, suppliers who can provide all of the services required to get goods finished, raw materials manufacturers, and then the logistics to tie it all together. And in this business, like many others in China, it all tends to be quite conveniently clustered. China is an economy of many clusters. You have this thing of like the whole town produces the same type of toy. I mean, I've even been to towns where they produce the eyeballs for a certain type of toy. And clothing obviously is no different. So you can position yourself in a location where there is a phenomenal degree of all the resources that you require for your particular business. And that's what these guys are doing. So to set up an operation like that, again, you can either set up a company yourself, or you can lean on an agent or a third-party provider to do all the hiring of staff and the subcontracting with the local manufacturers. Again, there's a few functions that you need to develop in order to do this. A finance function for dealing with all the payments, some expertise on import-export, and then some type of commercial function for actually negotiating with the third parties and managing the staff involved for that type of operation. So it's a little bit more involved than some of the previous ones, but still something that we see people coming into the market and doing. The picture in the background is obviously Alibaba, the most famous e-commerce company in China. And just to speak to the importance and how prevalent e-commerce is becoming in the China market, not only is it huge, which it is, and the uptake rate and the sophistication of some of the e-commerce services that you have in China, even outstripping what you find in the West. It is a phenomenally innovative market, but it's also becoming an increasingly easy one for Western companies to tap into. So in the past couple of years, this cross-border e-commerce has been jointly developed by the government and some of these big e-commerce companies to allow Western companies to sell their product directly onto these platforms. And the take-up from that has been very considerable. It's now very easy as a Chinese consumer to buy goods directly from the West through these e-commerce platforms. So a lot of Western brands, rather than trying to set up their own e-commerce presence in China, are plugging directly into these platforms, which is a really exciting development. It's also an interesting point worth reminding ourselves that the Alibaba IPO last year or the year before was, to this date, I think, still the largest in history. So it really does speak to just the sheer scale of the online economy in China. And next up here is an example of a way that we increasingly see the market going. And it's an example of a Canadian company who manufacture parts for e-bikes. And they've been sourcing out of China for some time, selling the goods in the West. But the reason they came to look at actually having a presence in China is because they had people knocking on their door wanting to buy their goods and wanting to buy them directly out of China. So rather than having them shipped to Hong Kong or to the West and then back in, round tripping, which obviously adds a lot of cost, doesn't make any sense. It's much more preferable to have either your own entity or an entity that you control in China that's buying from the factory, so your own OEM, well, obviously not a factory that you own, but the OEM factory that you've been using, and then selling on to your distributors and clients that you're developing in the country. And that way you can effectively firewall the factory from the distributors, because you want to avoid them being in a direct supply relationship, because then you lose all control of the situation. And also the entity that you have there is your means of taking your margin out of the business. So what we're in negotiations with these guys at the moment is about getting that entity set up. And this is something that we see more and more. So people that are purchasing out of China, but they're now shifting the business to, whilst continuing to use China as their operations for production, also looking to send into the market. Here, the principal functions are around finance and billing. So understanding how the taxes work in that kind of transaction. So in this case, when you're purchasing from the supplier, they provide you with physical tax invoices that are called fapiao, which allow you to then book that as a cost into the business. And then you're then obliged to issue similar tax invoices to your clients when you sell them through. And that requires a degree of paper production in the offices, and having a small team of people to manage that. And then figuring out the logistics and the order flow. It's not hugely complicated, but it is something that you require a degree of expertise. There is a knowledge base there that you need to get to grips with. The background picture here is linked to the previous one. It's about a festival in China called Singles Day. It's a little bit like Valentine's Day over here, I guess, but it's all about having people that are single, encouraging them to buy gifts for one another on this day. And I think they picked the 11th of November because that's all the ones, right? 1111, singles coming together. And it was actually developed by Alibaba, I believe. So it's a purely commercial idea. And the total value of transactions last year on Singles Day on Alibaba's platforms alone, I think it topped 100 billion US. I mean, it's a remarkably huge figure. And again, speaks to the degree to which the country has embraced online commerce, and potentially the opportunity, if you can get noticed on Alibaba's platforms like Taobao and Tmall, the rewards there that can be reaped are phenomenal. So to summarize some of the typical challenges that people face when they're setting up an entity or some form of fixed operations in China, here's a brief list. Now, one of them, Graham, you just touched on, is picking a location. And there'll be all, different companies will have all sorts of considerations for that. If you're a sourcing company, typically you want to be in the cluster for your industry, which we discussed before. If you're selling into China, then you need to be close to market. But there'll be other considerations in terms of ease of business and access, and also cost. I mean, some of the cities that Western companies have traditionally gone into, like Beijing, Shanghai, they are still very much the hubs for doing business. So if you're selling creative design agency services, for example, you kind of do need to be there because that's where all the business is. But you also need to be aware that the costs in those cities in terms of rents and staff, in many cases, are getting pretty close to what they'd be in the West, in some cases even exceeding. Next is the actual process of setup. Now, registering a company in China these days is getting easier. China is gradually, slowly edging its way up the scale of ease to do business. I think it's at 90th now in the world. And the number of processes required is gradually dropping. Now, it is easier to set one up in the free trade zone than elsewhere. However, you also need to be aware that free trade zone companies are more limited in terms of what they can do than domestic companies. So free trade zone in many ways is a little bit like they've moved the border. So you can bring goods in, you can have them stored in a bonded warehouse there, but those goods still are not in market. You still need to then get them through customs in order to get them to the main markets. So there's a degree of limitation on what you can do with a free trade zone company there. Now, the ease of getting a company set up is improving. But the knowledge base of actually managing one of those companies, on the whole, I would say is not getting that much easier. So as one thing becomes easier to do, another thing, so for example, visas for foreigners tends to get more difficult. And the tax code, if anything, the compliance requirements become harder and harder. So that's worth bearing in mind in terms of your strategy for how soon you decide to go it alone from an entity point of view. Obviously, staff hiring and management is one of the tricky parts. One part of that is getting wage costs correct, which seems to continue going up in China, but also figuring out how to get the contracts right, and social security and income tax payments for staff. They are still a little bit different for foreigners and locals. And so, this is where having somebody with some HR experience, either in-house or a third party, is very important. Tax and accounting.
I can tell you.
Oh, please. Hi, Graham.
Interrupt. I was just going to say, we conduct a survey of our members every year, and human resources issues are always really the top headache for the members. It's always, for the past 3 years, it's been 3 of the top 5 challenges they have: the labor costs, finding people with the right kinds of skills, and then retaining them as well. As people always frequently looking for a better deal somewhere else. So this is definitely one of the biggest areas that our members look at.
Right. And so they find the biggest challenges in terms of finding the right people, the cost of it, and then holding on to them, or they find the whole process of actually physically employing people to be challenging. Which is it?
The first one, finding the right people. The bureaucracy side seems to be improving. A few years ago, with the new labor law and social security transactions, that was also a headache. But now it's even just trying to find people and keep them.
Yeah, that's certainly true. I mean, when I first started working in China, I had colleagues that were earning 300 RMB a month. That was back in the late 90s. You now couldn't employ, and this is for full-time teaching staff. Now in a big city, you couldn't employ, I don't think, cleaning staff for less than about 2,000. So that's, and there are positions whereby in 10 years there have been, and those teachers now, they would be earning at least 5,000 or 6,000. So in 15 years, a 10 times factor in salaries growth is, that's really considerable. We have to sometimes on a biannual basis review salaries within the business, and we encourage our clients to do the same thing because there's a relentless march of cost increases for staff. Now, what this is all driving ultimately these days is productivity improvements, right? Because you either have to do the same with fewer people, or you have to do more with the people that you have. And I see in manufacturing, this is driving a significant amount of investment now in machinery. But if you're in a service industry, we see a lot of examples of people trying to find clever ways. So a friend of mine runs a business, and they've all decided to just work from home. Rather than facing Beijing traffic every day, they've set their business up, even though they all live in the same city, as a remote business, and they get together only for 1 day a week. And it's all about trying to find solutions to improve productivity so that they can afford to carrying on hiring and paying people.
Yeah, absolutely.
Big pressure for people. And then the last one to mention is about getting money in and out. And this is an area where, again, there's been quite a lot of change, but challenges remain. So the renminbi is becoming increasingly convertible, which is a great trend. That's going to make things much easier for doing business. And you can set up an RMB account in London these days and pretty easily have that money converted into foreign currency. So the challenge these days isn't so much there. It's more realizing that regardless of what currency the money is in, getting money in and out of China is still quite a challenge. Now, obviously, if you've got goods moving in and out, then that's fairly easy to do. You can make payments through state administration of foreign exchange if you've got all the documentation from customs for goods moving in and out. You can pay for services overseas. Now those transactions get taxed, but transferring money between entities inside and outside of China is still an incredibly hard thing to do. And this is an area that we often find ourselves supporting and helping clients. And you tend to find that these people have to, in a sense, overcapitalize their Chinese entities compared to elsewhere in the world, because the strains on cash flow are significant, partly because payment terms in China tend to be hard, but also just because it is difficult to move money around. So we tend to advise our clients to leave really quite a healthy cash cushion for any China entity and operations that you have set up, because opportunities for supporting them tend to be quite challenging. The picture behind here is the recent parades in Beijing to mark 70 years of the victory in the Second World War, as they call it, the victory over the fascists. And this was interesting for several reasons. Firstly, it's only recently that this has become a holiday in China, and says much more, I think, about current affairs and relations between China and its neighbors, particularly Japan, than it does necessarily anything about history. But also what was so striking about the parade this time, and I've been to some of these parades before in Beijing, that they are quite a show, but we're seeing foreign troops being paraded down Chang'an goose-stepping along with Chinese troops, and the view that China sees itself now as a regional and a global power, and that they were having these foreign armies coming and parading, was a really interesting new development, and I think speaks a lot to how China sees itself in the world these days. On the one hand, maybe a little bit less isolated, but also having influence and impact and might beyond its own borders. And finally here, to speak to some of the options that you would have if you need to get a presence set up in China in terms of some of the entities that you can use. So starting from the left-hand side, which is sort of greatest degree of independence, but also of difficulty and cost, is setting up a WFOE, a wholly owned foreign entity, a wholly foreign-owned entity. So in China, you're allowed to set up a company and own it 100% yourself within certain business categories. And you can trade within your own scope of business relatively freely using that. But what you find, though, is that the way entities are controlled and managed by the government in China vary really quite considerably from the West. They tend to be much more strictly controlled in certain areas. For example, you have to, the way the tax system works is very much an offline process with a high degree of control from the authorities. But in other areas, people tend to find it's quite loosely managed. So health and safety standards would be an example, or the degree to which certain policies are implemented or not implemented within grey areas, like certain sections of the So to take an example, foreigners paying social security. It's something that on paper you're supposed to do, but a lot of Western companies operate seemingly without consequence, without having their foreign staff signed up to these. So the trick in China is all about navigating common practice or best practice, which tends to be a tricky balance for companies from the West who are used to being in a situation of absolute compliance. And we often see, particularly legal departments of companies coming over here, struggling a little bit, figuring out what is allowed and what isn't allowed, and finding concepts like common practice to be a bit of a challenge. Moving along the list, there are still rep office that you can set up, which allows you to hire people but not enter into contractual business in country. Rep office is seemingly a little bit less popular these days because they get taxed in pretty similar ways to Woofy's, but you don't have the benefit of being able to trade with them. So we see people using those less. Similarly, joint ventures are not as common as they used to be, and partly because a lot of the categories, the business categories that joint ventures were allowed in, are now open to Woofy's. Although you still see people setting up a lot of joint ventures in categories that have restrictions. So automotive would be a good example of that. And then on the right-hand side are all the kind of third parties that you can lean on to fulfill some of these functions. So for example, you can use Fesco to hire staff. You can use agents like ourselves to fulfill all of these types of business functions. Or you can lean on distributors or people within your existing supply chain to fulfill some of these functions, like import-export, for example. And similarly, some of the remote office services these days are becoming broader in some of the services that they offer. So you can have a desk, you can have staff on the ground. Sometimes they'll even actually register and manage a company for you as well. Some of the chambers of commerce, I know that you guys in AmCham have a service whereby you can get staff on the ground, so you can get started with research or business development work that way. So there are a whole network and ecosystem of partners that can support with that. This picture here is Shanghai, downtown Shanghai. And what Shanghai has been in the news for quite a lot recently is these free trade zones. It was the place where we had the first one. That now are expanding all over the country and focusing on particular different areas of business. On the whole, our view of the free trade zones is that they are very helpful if you're in certain types of business. So for example, if you are in an e-commerce business and you want to bring goods in, have them in a bonded warehouse before you actually import them into country and pay import tax on them, they're a great way of shortening your lead times to delivery in market. But for most general businesses, to date, the advantages of free trade zones are not that clear. And their real value to us really is as a sort of sign of things to come, and to see what policies that the Chinese government is tinkering and toying with that may then get implemented into the economy as a whole. Which takes us back to where we started, downtown Beijing. These are my contact details, so feel free to reach out to me with any questions about what we've discussed today or business in China in general. And with that, Graham, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks indeed, Andy. That was fascinating stuff. I got just one question to wrap things up. Some of the photographs you showed there, stock market, the currency devaluation, people hear a lot of these things in the news, also things about intellectual property. It can make China look maybe quite a risky place to do business. How can you reassure people that those risks are in fact manageable, just like risks are anywhere else?
Well, the first thing to say is the thing that draws people out to China is the size of the prize, right? It's such a big market. It's one of the few areas of the world that seems to have this strong and consistent growth. And that's still there, regardless of local, more recent bad news. China is still a great place to go and do business. And whereas in the past it was a great place just to get stuff made and sourced, these days increasingly it's a place to go and sell, and not just to sell goods, but to sell services, and not just for large companies either. All the companies that we work with, they're small, medium businesses, and in some cases this is even their first international expansion. And so it's absolutely doable, and it's a very attractive place to do business if you can get it right. Now, China obviously is not without its challenges. The Chinese are very, very canny at setting up business in a way to benefit local. So if you look at, just to take as a small example, like the international schools in a lot of Western cities, it used to be the case that they were filled with the children of expatriates working in the cities, whereas these days increasingly they're the children of local kids, and they're the kids of local wealthy business people. And it's just one of these many, many small examples that speaks to how phenomenal transfer of wealth that has and is still occurring, and the Chinese's ability to capture value from international business. So if you go there, you have to expect to see a highly competitive market, and one where sometimes regulation doesn't always work in your favor. Those things are still the case. Having said that, it's such a large market. I heard a really good saying on this recently. If you're thinking of going to China, China is a bigger market than you can possibly comprehend. At the same time, it's a more competitive market than you can comprehend. And both of those things are true and to the extreme. So you can still do well in China, you can make a lot of money, but it is a learning curve, and you have to find partnerships and work with people that can guide you and help you on the ground. And realistically, you have to expect to spend a few years on that learning curve. Now, in terms of the recent economic news, 13% growth rates are not sustainable in the long term. I think China is reaching that point whereby its demographic tipping point has been reached. So its working age population is now shrinking rather than growing. There has been so much development and construction and building of new cities and airports, and that will continue. But you can only build so much before demand is eventually quenched. But the interesting point to note, Graham, is that let's say China grows 5-6% this year. The actual absolute value of that GDP growth is still greater than 13% back in 07-08, because it's from a much larger base. China is still growing by the size of Switzerland every single year. So give it 3-4 years, it still grows by the size of the entire United Kingdom market. It just has such phenomenal scale. So even if they manage 5-6% growth this year, that's still more than any other major economy. Now, many people had betted that growth in China would continue at those rates forever, and that just wasn't realistic, right? That's not a possibility. And some of those bets are now unraveling. So if you've invested in an enormous iron ore mine or whatever it may be, in Australia, things are cooling off in some of those supplier countries. But also it speaks to the shift that's happening in China. It is trying to restructure its economy from being investment and heavy industry led to being much more about services, about the consumer economy. And that process of switching is a threat to some people, but it's a great opportunity to everyone else. And you mentioned IP now. IP protection in China is stronger now than it ever has been. Now, there's certain particular steps that you have to take in order to protect your IP. But I have good friends making considerable amount of money on businesses like merchandising, for example, which rely entirely upon an effective IP system. And the reason they're able to do that, and the reason the country has tightened up on IP, is quite simply because so many local companies now are relying upon their brands, their patented designs, to earn a living, that it's reached its own critical mass. It's, the value of IP is not just something that's in the hands of foreigners anymore. They realize that for the development of their own local businesses and economy, that it's something that needs to be protected. And it is. You can hire lawyers these days that work on no-win, no-fee cases and will take court action for you, and then it gets implemented through the courts. I've got friends who've received significant payouts from courts. So the situation there has definitely improved. The past 2 or 3 years have been a bit of a turning point in that area too.
Great, good to know, Andy. Well, I think that's all we've got time for. I'd like to once again thank Andy Clayton from LNP China for sharing his insights on how to establish a presence in China. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Graham. It's a great pleasure.